My name is Donald Linderud. I work for WWF, but obviously on this project called Science-Based Targets for Finance. And I've been the product and project manager for the finance tool that we're going to present today, and that we're going to go through from a user perspective. Tomorrow, we're going to do this from a technical perspective as well. We have a second session today at 3 p.m. Central European time as well, if you want to watch a rerun and see how we do then. Or obviously, if you can't stay for the full duration of this session, you can obviously join then as well. So first things first, a bit of housekeeping. We do have a Q&A box. Please drop your questions in that, and we'll try to answer them during or after our presentation. And we will be recording, or we are recording this webinar right now, and you will be sent a link to the recording in your email tomorrow, along with the slides tomorrow. We're also, I hope you've seen, if there's any of your colleagues out there or friends that can't join a Zoom meeting, you did receive today a YouTube link in the reminder for this webinar. So we are also streaming on YouTube at the moment, just to make sure that everyone can follow. So we are going to do a very brief introduction, which is a lot less than 5 minutes, I hope. And I'm going to hand over to Nate Aiden, who is the project manager for Science-Based Targets for Finance, who's going to take you through a bit of the framework. And then I'm going to come back and talk a bit about the tool, and what you can do with that, how we built it, and what the purpose is, and so on. We're going to go through some one example of analysis and engagement strategy, and then Owen White from CDP is going to present the method for us and give us a little bit of a refresher on what the method actually, or what the methods actually entail for the finance tool, and then just finish off with couple of next steps on how you sort of get going with the finance tool. And then we leave hopefully plenty of time for you to ask your questions. So with that said, let's get going. Just to set the scene a little bit, we have just passed in the science-based targets. We've just passed 1,000 companies that have committed themselves to set science-based targets, which is great. As of yesterday, 485 of those have had their targets approved by the SBTi, and 60 financial institutions are committed to setting science-based targets. None of them are obviously approved, since we just launched the framework on the 1st of October, so no one has really had time to actually go through that process just yet. But we're hoping that we will see, and we're quite confident that we will see loads of you come through with that as well. With that, I'm going to hand over to Nate, who's going to give you a few minutes overview of the framework.
Thank you, Donald, and thanks to everyone for joining today. We're very pleased to have so much interest in the tool that we're launching as part of our framework. So I will just be providing a brief overview of the framework that we launched at the beginning of this month, to give some context for the tool and to understand how it fits in with our broader target setting approach here. So we launched the Science-Based Targets Initiative back in 2015, and we knew from the beginning that financial institutions would play an important role in the Science-Based Targets Initiative. We actually had 10 financial institutions commit to setting targets back in 2015, but we've held them in abeyance until now because we didn't have a proper framework for evaluating their investment and lending portfolio targets. We launched this project in 2018, and so this tool and the framework are the result of 2 years of stakeholder engagement, method development, and other work. And we're very pleased to have all of you interested in applying the tool. So the next slide shows the four components of the framework. The first is a set of methods that we have developed and refined over the past couple of years for target setting. The second is a set of criteria that are specific to financial institutions for assessing their targets once they are sent to the Science Based Targets Initiative. And these targets cover Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions of the financial institutions. The third is obviously the tool that we're focusing on here today. And then the fourth is a guidance document, which brings together these other three components, as well as some case studies and a how-to for financial institutions to actually set their targets. The next slide gives a description of the three methods that we have settled on for this phase. Right now, we are in the pilot phase of this project, and that started on October 1st. It goes for the next 6 months through April, when we expect to have revised criteria, both for financial institutions, but also for all companies. And we're going to be updating those criteria in coordination. So the three methods that we've settled on right now are the sector decarbonization approach, which is a physical intensity-based method that links with particular sectors or products. So for example, gram CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour of electricity generated, or gram CO2 equivalent per kilogram of steel produced. The second method is the science-based targets portfolio coverage approach, which is the idea that the financial institution engages with their investees to have them set their own science-based targets. And the idea for this approach is that the target is to have 100% coverage by 2040 and interpolate that on a linear basis. So if you're starting at 0 now in 2020, then you need to hit 25% by 2025. The third approach is a temperature rating approach, and it is the subject of this call that we will go into more depth to describe, but simply stated, it gives a temperature rating for various targets that are set by companies and aggregates those up to the portfolio level. So the physical intensity approach, and then these latter two approaches are engagement approaches, and the Science Based Targets Initiative has found that these types of approaches are effective way for financial institutions to tangibly and directly and transparently support Paris alignment within the broader economy. The next slide shows the linkage between these three methods and the asset classes that we have selected for this phase of our work. And you can see that it's not comprehensive. Rather, we're focusing on 4 asset classes that are real estate, mortgages, electricity generation, project finance, and then the broader asset class of corporate instruments, which includes equity and debt. For the first 3 asset classes, we have physical intensity approach. And then for corporate instruments, we allow all 3 approaches. So there's no requirement to do any particular approach for corporate instruments. The next slide gives a very high-level overview of the criteria for this project. And there are more than 20 criteria that have been specified in the guidance document and in a separate criteria document that's available on our project website. But suffice to say that, you know, the most complex and detailed area here is the Scope 3 portfolio coverage requirements. And we would encourage you to look at those closely in terms of understanding what's covered and what is not covered in this phase of the work. It's clear that from our perspective, this is an iterative process. And what we have published this month is covering a portion of portfolios, but not every single aspect of financial institutions' portfolios. We're starting where we do have clear links and where there are available methods, and we expect to expand and improve this as we go. The next slide just gives sort of a snapshot of the guidance document. So it's a 170-page document, which includes fairly comprehensive discussion of the whole framework. And it also includes these 8 case studies that you see listed here, which are intended to provide a clear illustration of these methods and resources. You can see that these institutions have applied the method to their actual data and situations where they can, and they've provided some commentary on how those look for them. So we would encourage you to take a look at the guidance document as well. And then finally, the point of all of this is to have target submissions from the financial institutions. So the first step is to commit and to send a commitment letter, and that period starts this month. And so we've already gotten some inquiries there. The next is to develop the target and then to submit it to the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And so we do have an incentive here for the first 20 financial institutions to be assessed free of charge. Normally, the Science-Based Targets Initiative has a roughly $5,000 cost recovery fee for this target review process. But the first 20 financial institutions, that fee will be waived. All of the materials that I've presented here today are available on our project website, which is here. And we would encourage you to contact targets at sciencebasedtargets.org if you have interest. Once the target is reviewed and approved, then there's communication between the initiative and the financial institution, and then there's disclosure afterwards in terms of how the financial institution is actually meeting its target or not. So that's a very brief, high-level overview of the Science-Based Targets Initiative Financial Sector Framework to give some context for today's discussion of the tool. Thanks again for everyone for joining, and now I'll pass it back to Donald.
Thank you, Nate. Good overview of the framework there. So we have just got the first question here. I just thought that we'd stop and take that straight away. I understand that the topic today is the temperature approach. Is there a workshop dedicated on the SBTi portfolio coverage? No, there isn't. However, the tool that we're presenting today is the same tool. So you almost get, when you do calculate the temperature scoring approach, which you will see in a few moments, you will also get the portfolio coverage stats for that particular portfolio. And we will talk a little bit about that, but maybe not that much in depth in terms of methodology. So what were the objectives when we started sort of building this tool? Well, obviously to cover, as I said, both the temperature rating and the portfolio coverage, because they are very related methodologies. We wanted this to be open source so that we can have continued development, not just from us, but from the open source community and such. And we wanted this to be as widely distributed as possible, naturally, to get a greater impact from this tool. We wanted it to be transparent so that you can follow from the corporate ambition saying that we're going to reduce emissions by this much to your temperature score, so you can follow the whole process from start to finish within the data. We wanted this to be data agnostic so that you are not locked into one specific data provider, and that you can even use your own data lake for this tool. We also wanted you to be able to use any user interface that you already have in terms of service providers or homegrown portfolio management solutions. So that's part of the requirements that we set out for this tool. And first, sort of maybe most importantly, I wouldn't say, but a very important part of it is that it's supposed to be a workflow tool for portfolio managers and analysts and compliance and risk managers and such, so that it doesn't become something that you take out of your bottom drawer once a year or once every 6 months, but that this can actually be an analytical tool that you can actually use on a daily or at least a weekly or monthly basis to manage your portfolios and to analyze companies, which is what we'd love for you to do. So in order to do that, we devised a development team around this, obviously taking in WWF and CDP and WRI into that, which are obviously the three of the founding members of Science-Based Targets. And we sent out an RFP for to get a developer or a couple of developers in this case to help us out to actually build this, to actually write the code for the solution. And that landed on Nordic Finance and OS Climate. And then to be able to, what I said before, fulfill those criteria of being able to link into loads of different databases and be as data agnostic as possible, and also to be as user interface as agnostic as possible, we linked up with a number of data and service providers, such as Bloomberg and CDP, naturally, ISS, MSCI, Trucost, and Urgentum. We're all part of the close-knit development team that that has been developing this solution, and they've been contributing a great deal to testing and to making sure that this can actually integrate and be used with our data. And to get the user perspective, we also align with the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance and had a few members from their organizations joining our project team as well to give their input on to make sure that we're building something that can actually be used by analysts and by portfolio managers and all the rest that is going to use this solution. So the structure of the tool is essentially what we built is the red part in the middle. It's, if you want to be mean, you can say, and if you want to be true, it is a calculator. That's what it is, right? We take some input data, which comes from a number of sources in terms of target data and portfolio data and financial data and emissions data. And we crank that in the calculator, convert the targets to temperature score to allow you to aggregate that up to portfolio and sector level, and to measure alignment with the Paris Agreement, for example, set portfolio emission targets and target companies for action, either through engagement on divestment or whatever sort of actions you have in mind for these companies. And then the calculator essentially sends this out to a user interface where you can interact with it, where you can set the options, and where you can obviously get the results from that calculator. And that can obviously be your Bloomberg terminal or your ISS report or MSCI or any of the others, and your homegrown portfolio management solutions, if you have those. And this is very much, as I said, for ESG teams and portfolio managers, financial analysts, compliance, risk, CIOs, and such. And naturally, one of the outputs here is also for you to be able to report back to the science-based target and say, hey, we want to set our own science-based target for our financial institution, and the tool has the solution to let you do that. And another important factor here is also to naturally, this can be used, we anticipate at least, depending on where the legislation or where the regulation actually falls in terms of the EU disclosure regulation, but it should be able to fulfill the requirements there as well. So this slide is essentially just a bunch of web links that I'm going to leave with you, but it shows you where you can sort of find more information about the tool and such. This analysis workflow example is essentially what I'm going to go through right now and show you a little bit on how that actually works. So what can we use this tool for? Well, as a portfolio manager or analyst, you can obviously analyze companies and sectors and their contribution to climate change. You can naturally measure a portfolio's temperature score, but you can also identify sort of the biggest contributors to devise your sector allocation or security selection, for example. But more importantly, you can also model impacts of engagement on the temperature score, so that you can plan your engagement strategies going forward and see where your engagement is going to have the greatest effect on both the climate and on your portfolio's temperature score, naturally. So what data do you need for this? Well, you need holdings data, naturally. So this is a sample of all the data that we're going to show you here today. Even if you see company names, they have nothing to do with those companies. It's complete random data, so don't get bogged down with that. So this is the input file for the portfolio data. So as you can see here, company names and some identifiers and some weights. But in the very right column there, you have engagement target. Keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that for the what if analysis a little bit later. We need some financials and emissions data. So this could be sort of revenue and enterprise value, market cap, and those kind of things, but also obviously greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3, and so. And more importantly, we need emissions reduction targets. So the absolute or intensity targets that company have set and say, hey, we're going to reduce our emissions by this much by this particular date, for example. And that is always a question. So how much of this data is actually available? When you actually start to scan this and you find that there is about 4,000 publicly disclosed targets in the market at the moment. And on top of that, there's a bit of overlap, obviously, with that. But we also have, as I said, 485 targets that have been approved by the SBTi. And if we're talking in the ESG space, in the E space, this is quite good. This is a quite good universe. I've spent quite a lot of time at Bloomberg devising solutions for ESG before, and the data quality, or rather the data scarcity, is a big issue, obviously, in the environment, the environmental part of the ESG formula. So with that, I think that we have a pretty good coverage for this. So the analysis process that we go through here is a 4-step process. We convert a target, convert the ambition to a score, and we generate a company level score, and then we aggregate that on a portfolio level, and then we can do some scenario analysis on those. So the conversion, and Owen is going to go into this in more detail later, so I'm just going to give you sort of the headlines for this. So we're going to convert the targets that companies set. We are going to reduce our emissions by 35% by 2025, say. We take that and we say, okay, first, is this a valid target? Is this good enough quality-wise? We have a minimum quality criteria. And we say, yeah, okay. So then we use the IPCC scenarios in order to map that to what that would mean in terms of warming of the planet by 2100. And then we aggregate, because companies can set a number of different targets on different timeframes and scopes and such. So we need to aggregate those up to a overall company level target. Which is what we do in step 2. And we also then apply a default target. So if there is a target out of this matrix of targets that you see here that this company hasn't set, for example, they haven't set a short-term scope 3 targets, for example, that's then going to be a default score. That default score is by default 3.2 degrees currently. And then we weight those targets based on reported emissions, and then we get a company temperature score. Then we aggregate those. We're going to come back to the aggregation methods here a little bit later. But we aggregate those on a portfolio level or a sector or a market level, whatever you want to do this on, naturally, to get a portfolio temperature score. And then we can do some what if analysis on that, and we have 6 different engagement scenarios built into this tool. One thing, so these are the aggregation methods that we have in this solution, and as you can see here, the very first one, if you look at the different temperature scores, this is run on a 100 stock or 100 company portfolio, global portfolio, well diversified portfolio throughout the sectors, and these. And the first one is obviously the one that we would least favor, the WATS, the weighted average temperature score, which is essentially portfolio weights, because it doesn't really take emissions into account at all. And that is also the odd one out, giving you the lowest the lowest temperature rating in general. So I'll leave that with you for now. One thing to keep in mind here, when I go through this, as this is an open source solution, we or you or other developers can obviously modify this as they wish. So all the aggregation methods and all the scenarios that we present here and everything else can obviously be made very differently, depending on your particular requirements. So in this example, we are going through a company temperature. We get a company temperature score. As we talked about before, we get and the tool produces a portfolio temperature score. In this case, we're running this on a 50 company portfolio with completely randomized data, as I said. So you get here, we've just displayed the midterm targets of 5 to 15-year targets for scope 1 and 2, and then for scope 1, 2, and 3, which comes in at 2.6 and 2.9 degrees roughly. And here comes the portfolio coverage one, which is sort of almost a byproduct of the temperatures of this tool, where you can see that the portfolio coverage is around 35% for this particular company. So, which means that 35% of your holdings in your portfolio have set a science-based target approved by the science-based targets. So many solutions are stopped here, and we could have stopped here as well, which is important enough to have this information. But we thought, well, what can we do with this, and how do we actually devise an engagement strategy? Well, first we need to know where my hotspots are, and one way of getting to know that is obviously to look into a heat map and do some sector analysis. And what we see from here is, for example, that the Asian industrials stand out in our heat map because they are quite different to the European and North American industrials. So we may have an issue there that we can maybe address. And also, interestingly, obviously, the energy sector is naturally a high emitting sector. So maybe we should pay close attention to that. And we see that is coming in at 3 degrees, which is not brilliant. So maybe we can do something about that. But also the communication services, why is that at 3 degrees? We should really dig into this a little bit deeper. So we can do that by producing a table like this, for example. And as I said, you can obviously devise these as you want. These are taken straight out of the Jupyter notebooks that I showed you a link to before, and that we can go into further if anyone has any questions around this. But for example, here we are looking at the ownership percentage and the contribution. Those are the numbers that I'm mostly interested in. So the ownership is obviously how much of this company's stock I actually own. So here we have 2 companies where I own almost 5% and then 12% of these particular companies, and they contribute quite a lot to my overall to my overall temperature score in my portfolio. And this can obviously be done. This is, for this particular purposes, it's actually done on the portfolio level, but we could do this on the sector level if you wanted to do that instead. Why? And so I'm doing this for one purpose, and that is sort of where do I spend my time most wisely in terms of engagement? Well, obviously where I can have the greatest impact. So company N, I own 0.2% of that company. If I go to the management there and say, hey guys, you really need to do something about your carbon emissions here and your effect on the climate, the likelihood that they're listening to me is a lot less than if I own 12% of that of a company. So obviously for company N, we can maybe shove that into engagement through CA 100 plus, for example, and similar initiatives to get together with our other investors. But these two, I probably have a fair chance of actually making my voice heard and actually getting some traction with that. So let's do that. So what we can then say, okay, we can turn to our what if scenarios here and say, I'm going to choose one of these scenarios here to see what my portfolio looks like when I've gone through this process with them and provided that I'm successful. And what I'm going to pick is actually scenario 4A, which is sort of trying to at least get these companies to set a 2-degree target. That's sort of the base level. And if we run the portfolio again through that scenario, what if scenario, this is what we're going to get. So remember that we've only changed 2 companies here in a 50 company portfolio. And our initial scope 1 and 2, which we remember since before, was 2.6 degrees. And the new score for the overall portfolio is 2.4 or 2.5 degrees in this particular case. That may not be that much, but I mean, it's 2 companies out of a 50 company portfolio, and we gave them a pretty low bar to get under. So we obviously need to do a lot more to that target to reach a 1.5 degree target, for example. But we can also look at this from sort of a sector basis here, and we can see we've actually reduced the temperature score for the energy sector and the communication services sector from around 3 to now around 2 degrees, which is obviously a great start. So our engagement seems to be having a good sort of effect on where we on our portfolio and hopefully on the client as well. So the solution here is obviously to model other scenarios with different companies and focus on other sectors and regions. And you can do that either through the tool, or you can obviously output and dump all the data that you get out of the tool as a data dump, and which is what we see here, sort of target data, emissions and fundamentals and financials, input and temperature score. So you can follow, as I said, this gives you the transparency to follow everything from the first to the last calculation through this tool. Now, coming back to reporting, what we were talking about before. So you've devised your engagement strategy, you feel quite happy with that you can reach whatever target you set yourself to reach. Then you want to submit this to the science-based targets for validation and hopefully for approval. And then you can use a different notebook, which is the number 5 in we'll show you some links to those in a moment. But this is the number 5 in the pre-made notebooks that we made for you, and that gives you a first sort of a report card on what kind of settings we use. So here we can see that we actually did use this weighted average temperature score aggregation method, and we used the default score of 3.2. And these are sort of the key results here, that our portfolio coverage, as we remember, was about 35%, and our current temperature scores are these. But also, we also get sort of a portfolio coverage for the temperature score part as well. So, and probably we should stop there and explain the difference between these two. So, the portfolio coverage method only uses the science-based, the companies that have had targets approved by the science-based targets. The last figure they see here on the scores that are based on default scores here is a slightly different number, because what we're doing with the temperature score is that we also allowing, obviously, not only targets that have been approved by the science-based targets, but also the rest of these 4,000 companies or the 4,000 targets that are out there in the market to potentially be included in that temperature score, depending on whether they are of good quality enough, so to speak. So therefore, you get a slightly different number from those default scores there. Remember, these are totally random numbers, so if something doesn't add up for you, that is totally expected. So, and in order to send this to us, you obviously don't want to send this with your holdings, but you can anonymize this data. There is a function for that that is called anonymize, funnily enough, so that we strip out any identifiers, but you can still submit all the underlying data that you use, so that our target validation team can actually go through and validate this and hopefully approve that target for you. So to sum up, the finance tool solution is essentially providing analysis and modeling and reporting for alignment, target setting, and for engagement strategies for financial institutions, investments, portfolios. With that, I'm going to hand over for a quick recap of the temperature scoring methodology by Owen.
Thank you, Donald. I'm not sure if I can move the slides, but if not, if we can go to the next slide. Yeah. So yeah, thanks, Donald. I want to kind of spend a few minutes today just on maybe a recap of the methodology for those who haven't come across it yet, which might help to give some kind of further context for why we developed the tool and actually how we developed the tool that Donald has spoken about. So essentially, this work, has emerged from earlier work at the SBTi, where we classified the temperature alignment of 3 kind of long-term goals, and this was the goals outlined in the Paris Agreement. It was 2 degrees, well below, and 1.5. And still within the SBTi, we are able to classify all submitted targets against these 3 temperature goals. But the SBTi targets currently represent a pretty small universe compared to all publicly disclosed targets. So right now we have about 500 approved SBTs, with another 500 companies who are committed, so they're in the process of setting them. But we wanted to essentially extend this analysis to all public targets. So as Donald mentioned, we have around 4,000 targets disclosed each year. So we wanted to be able to provide a similar assessment to all public targets. And we wanted to do that assessment over a much wider range of temperatures. So we wanted to extend the temperature envelope beyond simply the 3 long-term goals that are outlined in the Paris Agreement, but to cover essentially all temperatures from 1.5 up to about 4 to 5 degrees Celsius. And this will allow us essentially then to assess any public greenhouse gas target against any temperature goal. So the next slide outlines essentially the kind of the logic behind doing this is currently it is very difficult to compare the ambition of corporates based on their targets. So targets are typically set over a large number of emission scopes. They cover intensity targets, absolute targets over different time frames. So to compare them, it's traditionally been quite difficult. So essentially the temperature scoring approach, and what this tool does, it effectively translates all of these different types of targets into a single common and intuitive metric that's based on temperature. And as you can see here from the graphic, effectively it allows us to take various types of targets, convert them into this common unit so we can easily compare them. And it also then is a good proxy to tell us how far are these companies away from the actual global goals that we need to meet. So we can very easily see then across sectors and industries, the relative ambition of companies. And then within portfolios, it's much easier to identify, which companies are actually best performing compared to the laggards, which are actually not doing enough to meet these global goals. So the next slides are essentially just kind of an overview of the method, and this is the method that is largely embedded in the tool now. And there's three key steps. The first step is kind of the core scientific step, which essentially allows us to convert the ambition of any target into a temperature. And to do this, we use the IPCC special report models on temperature for 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we've created a series of regression models for all different types of sectors, different timeframes, different target types. And that allows us then to essentially map any public target. So this could be an intensity target in the power sector, for example, and then we have actually a model then to convert the ambition of that target into an actual temperature. And I'll go into a little bit more detail in the next slide about how that actually works. But that is kind of the first key step. The second step then is very much at a company level. So companies can disclose many different targets. So they may have targets for scope 1 and 2, for scope 3, short-term, mid-term. And what the step 2 of the process actually does is it aggregates these targets to produce one representative company score for each scope and for each time frame. And we have the short-term, mid-term, and long-term time frames that we define. So this allows us then, where we have cases of companies with multiple targets, to aggregate those into a single score at the company level. We also have included here then this default scoring approach, which we outlined previously, and this is applied to any company who does not have a publicly disclosed target, or for example, who has a publicly disclosed target, but it doesn't contain sufficient information for us to assess it. So for example, they may have a scope 1 and 2 target, but they may not have defined the boundary coverage of that target or the time frame. And in that case, then we wouldn't have sufficient information, and the target would instead be default scored. This default scoring approach is also used quite a lot for companies without scope 3 targets. So we have the case where a company will disclose a scope 1 and 2 target, but they will not have a target on their scope 3 emissions. And in that case, we're able to score the scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then we use the default approach to score their scope 3 emissions. And then the final step being the kind of aggregation, the weighting of these company level scores into a portfolio level score. And for this, we take the individual temperature scores from the companies, and then depending on the weighting method chosen, we have greenhouse gas emissions data and also some company financial information depending on the weighted method that we can use to aggregate those scores into an overall portfolio level score. So the next slide just gives you a little bit more detail on the kind of the regression, and this is sort of the core scientific step that we undertook as part of this methodology. And essentially the hypothesis is quite simple, is we defined kind of a linear relationship between the slope of these emission profiles compared to the global warming potential that actually results. So what we have actually done then is we've created unique regression models for a number of different sectors. So where we have sector pathways available, so for example, power, cement, steel, aluminium, transport, and we also have some economic pathways. So these are companies who've defined targets on the basis of value added or revenue. So we have specific global pathways for this, and we have defined then a series of regression models for these specific pathways, and we have defined them over a number of different time periods. So we've gone from between 5 and 30 years in the future, where we can actually assess targets that are disclosed over that time frame. So we've created hundreds of different regression models. And so if you go to the next slide, we can just see an example of one of these approaches. So this is for the global emissions set. So this is for any company who've defined a absolute target on greenhouse gas emissions, and they don't have a specific sector pathway. we have a regression model here across 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from the reporting year of that target. And essentially what we do then, what the tool does, it takes the ambition of the target, and we look at the amount of emissions that are expected to be reduced each year of that target. These are our linear annual reductions, and then we map that to the regression model, in which we can then define the global warming potential that would result from that target actually being implemented. So we do have these models available then for all different time frames and for a whole series of different sectors, and also then these general economy pathways for companies who are not mapped to a particular sector. The second step then, as I mentioned, is this company protocol, where we have potentially many different targets disclosed by corporates. And what the tool essentially does then is we have a number of these different filtering steps. So first of all, we will split up the targets by scope. So we will take the scope 1 and 2 targets, the scope 3 targets. If a company has defined these combined scope 1, 2, and 3, we will split them if we have sufficient information to do so. We will separate them into short-term, mid-term, long-term targets. We assess their boundary coverage. We conduct the filtering steps. If they have potentially multiple mid-term targets covering scope 1 and 2, then we will actually perform a filtering step to select the representative target. And then from this, we will be able to produce the final scores. And we have up to 6 kind of final scores can be produced. That would be short-term, mid-term, and long-term scores for both scope 1 and 2 and for scope 3. Our preferred approach from this is the midterm time frame. This is the kind of representative time frame for climate action, and also the key time frame that the SBTi uses when they validate targets. The next slide then just kind of outlines essentially an example of what this kind of looks like, at a kind of a theoretical level. Is we will be able to essentially assign scores to all of these various scopes and timeframes. So in this example, we have essentially that the company has set only 2 targets. So they have midterm and long-term targets on scope 1 and 2, and they are respectively scored at 1.8 degrees and 1.9. But for all other timeframes and scopes, so all scope 3 targets, there's no target available, so we give it a 3.2 degree default score. And then what the tool also does at the end then is we can actually aggregate that, and we can weight those to produce scope 1 plus 2 plus 3 scores. And these will all be weighted based on greenhouse gas emissions within the company level. So even though the company has only disclosed targets on specific scopes and timeframes, we essentially are able to produce an assessment of all scopes and all timeframes when we also incorporate this default scoring approach. And yeah, just the final slide for me then is just on this weighting approaches. As Donald has already mentioned, we have currently 7 different approaches available. We have done an assessment of this on some sample portfolios, and while there's pros and cons to all different methods, we are certainly preferring right now the kind of options 2 to 7, which have some form of greenhouse gas weighting and some sort of kind of financial ownership approaches, either based on market cap or enterprise value, total assets or revenue. These scores are typically quite consistent, whereas the option 1, the weighted average temperature score, which just uses the portfolio holdings, often gives a kind of a skewed result because it's not actually linked in any way to the greenhouse gases of the company. But within the tool, you have the option to select, various aspects of these weighting approaches that can be used then for various purposes. So I think that's all from me. So I'll hand you back to Donald.
Thank you, Owen. Thanks for that. Good to get a recap of the methodology and such. So the next steps here before we go into sort of Q&A, we have quite a lot of questions. We wouldn't have time to go through all of them, but we're going to cover some. But just to make sure that you're not sort of left on your own in this, as I said, we did engage with quite a number of companies here. And most of these that you see here do provide some sort of solution for this tool, whether it's data to be used, target data, financial data, emissions data, or whether it's API based solutions or Python-based solutions to integrate this into your workflow. And also at the very bottom, please go through this interactive workflow example, play around with it. You can't break anything. Just have fun with that and see where that takes you. And naturally reach out to us as well. And as I said, initially, we're running this workshop again this afternoon at 3 p.m. Central European time. So if you missed something or want to hear us again, then obviously tune in then. Tomorrow, we're running a much more technical workshop as well, where we're looking at how we can actually integrate this solution into our user environment and such. And we're running that at 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. Central European time tomorrow as well. So with that, I think we're up to about 7 minutes of Q&A. That took a little bit longer than anticipated. But first question, and we're lucky to have David from ISS with us, because the first question that we have out today is, how can I access the raw data needed for the tool? I think David, since you come from sort of a data provider here, maybe you could be helpful in answering this.
Yes, sure. So David here from ISS ESG, the climate team. I first want to congratulate the SBTi and all the partners for this tool. I think it's great and a complementary tool with including targets in this type of analysis. So in terms of data, I think that's something that, of course, we and other projects can assist with and help with the input file and the mapping needed for the information to be fed into this tool. So that's something, a mapping we have in place, and something that anyone interested can reach out to us or any other provider to get that kind of information. And also maybe just as a second question, I think we can also address the company ID. Maybe I think that's a great implementation in the input file. For example, for fixed income portfolios, you can use the mapping for the issuer ID or any identifier that's used by the data providers to link the securities in a way. If it's not directly an equity exposure, that input field of the company ID can be used to help with the mapping. So that's also something that we can assist with if looking at a portfolio that's not purely equity based.
Thank you, David. We have another question here, which can be interesting, which is sort of a little bit left field what we're talking about here. We had another question asking around sort of, is this just for listed instruments? And it's probably easiest to be used with listed instruments, so listed equities and tradable bonds. But it can be used for, in theory, for pretty much anything that with the required data, naturally. So that brings us on to another question that is related. How can banks use this tool for their lending? Most clients are not listed companies with public targets. So I don't know if any one of my colleagues want to take that, maybe Owen or Dan, that we have with us from Mortic as well, which has been involved in developing this solution for us.
Yeah, happy to take that, Donald. So as we kind of mentioned, if there are no public targets available for the institution, then we apply the default scoring approach. So still in the absence of that data, they can be included in the assessment. So in this case, they would receive just a 3.2 degree default. But when it comes to the overall portfolio weighting approaches, and they're still able to be included. So while you may not learn a lot from the individual corporate score, essentially you just get the default and we have no public information, it will be able to be included when we bring it to a portfolio level.
Thank you. And to be important to remember here when we're talking about that is obviously that this is a tool primarily, I would say, for engagement. And you may think, well, we don't have data for this and we don't have data for that. But the point is here that this tool is sort of a way to get the data. We want this tool to be used in order to engage with companies to make sure that they do set targets. And when they've set the targets, we sort of half the battle is obviously won, where they've sort of realized that they need to do something and taking action on that. And I think that's important to have that in the back of your mind, because if we did have a portfolio coverage score that came out with 75% or something like that, this would be not such a fruitful sort of exercise, really. Have you guys seen any of my colleagues here, or have seen any other good questions that we can answer in the last few minutes?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Donald. This is Nate. And just one question which has come up with a couple of the attendees, and thanks for all the questions, by the way, regards the where there's multiple asset classes and even multiple sectors for a particular institution. And yeah, this is understood that institutions won't just slot into one method or one asset class all the time. And so we do anticipate there being targets based on multiple methods and multiple sub-targets, if you will. This is something that we've also navigated with companies in the real economy with those 480 approved targets that we have. And so it's something that we'll be hashing out more clearly during the pilot phase. But we sort of take generally a bottom-up approach where there is a clear connection. We make that. We specify how much is covered of the portfolio in terms of emissions or AUM, and we cover what we can with what we have so far. But thank you for the question.
Thanks, Nate. We have another question here, essentially asking, do you have a breakdown of the public targets by temperature? I don't know if you, Owen, have seen anything like that, or if you've done any studies like that.
So we've done some, essentially they have not disclosed sufficient information. So that is typically the case with companies, particularly around scope 3, of course, but also with scope 1 and 2. Where right now what we've seen on disclosed targets is many targets are actually set for 2020. So they're kind of historical targets that have used 2020 as the target year, and in those cases we do not actually assess them because they're not forward looking. So we expect from kind of this year's disclosure figures to start seeing companies setting more long-term targets, 2025, 2030 targets. So we would expect to see kind of a much broader universe of targets at that point. From the targets we have assessed, I think the majority still fall between the 2 and 3 degree range. So they're they're ambitious targets, but they do not actually kind of fall below the SBT requirements of below 2 degrees.
I think we're 1 minute over time here, so we're gonna finish this session today. Please come back for the afternoon if your question hasn't been answered. We try to come back to you, all of you, and answering these questions in a way. I can just finish off here. What if the majority of my clients hasn't set the reduction targets? Can I still use the tool? I think that we've answered that in a number of ways today. That yes, you can. One way is to go out there and actually get the data and actually ask them to actually set targets, which makes it easier to do that. But also that if they haven't set targets, then they will be slotted into the default score. Anything that any of my colleagues want to sort of add before we close today?
Just thanks everyone for joining, and we look forward to working with you to set targets.
Very much so. Thank you, Nate, David, Dan, Owen, who were on this call today and helped out answering a lot of questions. Please tune in this afternoon or more importantly, tomorrow, if you are a little bit technically inclined and want to know how to integrate this into your institution and such. Thank you very much for tuning in, and apologies for running a couple of minutes over time. I hope it was all worth it for you. Thank you, and have a good day, afternoon, morning, wherever you are. Thank you. Bye-bye.